Imagine a world built for absolute perfection. Every need is effortlessly met. Food is endless. Water never runs dry. There are no diseases. There are no predators. There are absolutely no threats of any kind. You would think this is paradise. You would think they would thrive forever. You would be wrong. In just a few generations, this flawless utopia entirely collapsed. Every single resident died. Because absolute perfection is actually the most brutal death sentence. Nothing survived. Nobody escaped. This is Universe 25, the most disturbing experiment ever run on a society. In 1968, an American scientist named John Calhoun built something he called a paradise for mice. Soft nesting material in every corner. The temperature held perfectly stable. The cages cleaned by hand on a schedule. They were the healthiest specimens from the breeding colony of the National Institutes of Health. He constructed this specific environment to track explosive growth and the ultimate demise of a population when granted infinite resources. There was no shortage of food. There was no shortage of water. There was absolutely no risk. The architecture of this enclosed utopia was meticulously calculated. Every wall, every feeding station, and every dispenser was engineered to eliminate competition. An animal in the wild spends its entire existence fighting just to survive until tomorrow. They forage, they hunt, they hide. Here, they did nothing but exist. The fundamental friction of life was entirely removed. For the first few months, the system functioned exactly as a paradise should. The mice settled into their new surroundings. They explored the geometry of their perfect enclosure. They established their initial social hierarchies without violence. They groomed themselves. They ate. They slept. The air was quiet, interrupted only by the rustle of healthy animals moving through a pristine habitat. It was the absolute zenith of safety. It was an existence devoid of suffering, devoid of anxiety, and devoid of the harsh realities of nature. Calhoun stood above this sanctuary, watching as the first litters were born into a world without scarcity. The food hoppers remained perpetually full. The water bottles never ran dry. Every single newborn mouse survived its infancy. There was nothing to cull the weak. There was nothing to thin the herd. The paradise was performing flawlessly. It was a triumph of artificial design. But a paradise built without friction contains a hidden flaw. The perfection of the environment guaranteed that the fundamental rules of biology would soon be tested. Everything was utterly serene, calm, and perfectly balanced. The animals were content. The colony was thriving, mating was successful, a perfect society had been achieved, and absolutely nothing was wrong. Everything was flawless, peaceful, and beautifully designed. Mating rituals were completely normal. Mothers cared for their young. All basic biological needs were met instantly. Nothing was missing. That is, until the moment when the entire population inevitably began to double. The population exploded. Every 55 days, the number of individuals doubled. What began as an abundance of space rapidly contracted. The physical boundaries of the enclosure never changed, but the density of bodies inside it surged. They filled the nesting boxes. They crowded the ramps. The paradise was rapidly becoming a trap. By day 315, the sheer volume of animals forced a critical shift. In a natural environment, when a territory becomes overpopulated, the surplus generation simply leaves. They immigrate. They scatter across new lands to establish their own hierarchies. Inside this closed system, there was no new land. There was no escape. The young males matured into a society where every physical territory was already claimed. Every social role was already occupied. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They were biologically mature, but socially obsolete. The dominant males, exhausted from constantly defending their expanding families, began to fail. They could no longer maintain order. The surplus males, rejected and purposeless, drifted toward the center of the enclosure. They formed massive, listless pools of bodies on the cold floor. What happens to a society when there is no purpose left to strive for? The answer manifested as a catastrophic breakdown of basic instincts. They stopped acting like individuals. A terrifying phenomenon emerged, a complete collapse of social logic. Even though perfectly good, entirely full feeding stations were available throughout the entire enclosure, the animals refused to eat alone. They developed an obsessive, compulsive need to crowd around a few specific feeders in the center. The presence of others became a bizarre prerequisite for feeding. Hundreds of bodies jammed together, frantic and agitated, fighting for access to food that was freely available just a few feet away in completely empty hoppers. The friction was constant. Violence sparked in these crowded pockets, not over resources, but over sheer physical proximity. They attacked each other without any logical reason. They absorbed the damage, stood up, and remained in the chaotic mass. The social structure fractured entirely. The females, unable to rely on the exhausted males for protection, were forced to defend their own nests. The constant stress of fending off erratic intruders destroyed their maternal instincts. They began to abandon their young. They scattered them randomly across the enclosure. The fundamental biological drive to sustain the next generation simply evaporated under the crushing weight of extreme overcrowding. Some females simply retreated. They climbed up to the highest, most isolated apartments and barricaded themselves away from the terrifying chaos below. They severed all ties with the community. They stopped participating. They stopped reproducing. The physical bodies were still breathing, but the intricate social fabric that defined them as a functioning species was tearing apart at the seams. The environment was still perfectly climate controlled. The pure water was still flowing. The fresh food was still infinite, but the psychological architecture of the entire colony was crumbling. This was the exact moment the paradise officially transformed into an inescapable, brutal nightmare. The violence eventually burned itself out. The frantic energy of the overcrowded paradise did not lead to an endless war. Instead, it led to something far more chilling. A profound and unnatural silence fell over the colony. The population reached its absolute peak. After that exact moment, the fundamental drive to continue the species simply vanished. Reproduction completely stopped. The nurseries were empty. The sprawling walk-up apartments housed a new and terrifying generation. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. They were a generation born into a world where every single social role was permanently occupied. They had no territory to claim. They had no mates to court. They had no young to protect. So, they simply opted out of the society altogether. They retreated entirely into themselves. Their daily routine was stripped of all natural complexity. They just woke up. They ate from the perpetually full hoppers. They drank from the endless water bottles. They groomed themselves obsessively. Then, they simply went back to sleep. That was their entire existence. They never engaged in a single fight. They never received a single scar. Their fur was absolutely flawless. They looked, externally, like the healthiest, most perfect specimens the colony had ever produced. But beneath that pristine surface, they were functionally dead. Their nervous systems had developed in an environment completely devoid of meaningful challenge or social purpose. They had lost the capacity for complex behavior. When placed in the presence of willing females, they did not know how to initiate courtship. When faced with a threat, they did not know how to defend themselves. They moved through the crowded enclosure like ghosts, completely ignoring the thousands of other bodies surrounding them. They existed in a state of absolute isolation, despite being trapped in the densest population imaginable. This was the final phase. This was the demise. The colony had entered a terminal decline from which it would never recover. The physical infrastructure of the paradise remained completely intact. The temperature was still perfectly regulated. The food supply was still infinite, but the society itself was extinguished. The mice suffered two distinct deaths. The first was the death of the spirit. The second was the death of the body. The death of the spirit happened long before their physical heart stopped beating. The beautiful ones lived out their days in a state of perfect, undisturbed apathy. They aged slowly in their immaculate cages. They waited for the end in absolute comfort. They were free from disease. They were free from predators. They were free from starvation. But they were also totally free from the friction that makes existence meaningful. The paradise had successfully eliminated all physical suffering, but in doing so, it had also completely eradicated the biological essence of the species. The perfect world had bred the perfect survivors, but they had absolutely nothing left to live for. They were just breathing statues in a graveyard of endless, perfectly designed, and completely useless abundance throughout the entire silent enclosure. When the results of this experiment became public, the world drew the most obvious conclusion. Comfort kills. Abundance kills. A life with no struggle is a life that destroys itself. Urbanists, politicians, and philosophers all pointed to this closed ecosystem as a dark warning for our own rapidly expanding cities. We looked at the beautiful ones and saw a terrifying reflection of human apathy, but that popular interpretation completely missed the actual truth. The scientists who designed this closed universe did not believe that abundance was the true enemy. In his 1973 paper detailing the explosive growth and demise of this population, his actual conclusion was far more profoundly disturbing. The real killer was not the infinite food. It was not the perfect temperature, the perfectly clean water, or the complete absence of natural predators. The real killer was the total disappearance of meaningful roles. When a population grows far beyond the supply of roles that society can offer, the individuals with absolutely no purpose simply stop functioning. The invisible structure that gives every single member of a species a vital reason to actively participate in its own continued survival completely evaporates. Comfort did not kill them. It just removed the friction that made being alive feel like something. We are not so different from the subjects in that enclosure. We are constantly striving to eliminate every hardship from our modern existence. We build networks, we automate our labor, we engineer our own version of a flawless sanctuary. But we must remember the terrifying loop of that perfectly designed paradise, a perfectly designed world. Unlimited food and unlimited water, absolutely no threats of any kind, and a complete, silent extinction that no single toxicology report could ever possibly explain. The subjects inside that terrifying experiment never had a choice in how their society was structured. We still do. What happens next is entirely on us. Zen? Okay.